allow me to offer a more official welcome. I'm Rabbi Rachel Mikva. I am the Herman Schulman Chair in Jewish Studies here at Chicago Theological Seminary, and I'm also the director of our Center for Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Studies, which we call JCIS, because otherwise it's really a mouthful. So JCIS promotes interreligious cooperation and understanding through a variety of programs, including lectures and workshops, symposia, holy day celebrations, worship services, arts and social justice projects. This community organizing workshop is important to the center because for a number of reasons. One is that it introduces basic skills for building bridges of all kinds within community. And these bridges are ultimately really about relationships that where we can work together to improve the lives of people in our communities. The second reason is that interreligious cooperation and understanding cannot simply be clergy and religious leaders talking to each other. Right? We tried that model from about like the 50s on, and it made for a little bit of change, but not substantive, transformative change. Right? That kind of change requires building from the ground up and around issues that matter most in people's lives. And the third reason is that this particular engagement in community organizing is one that reflects on the ways in which it is itself a spiritual practice. It's a spiritual practice that many of us share, no matter how we orient around religion, even though we may engage it differently and may conceive of it differently. So last week, we looked at the history of community organizing in Chicago and beyond, some of the methodological and philosophical differences, and also began to exercise that most basic foundational skill, the one-on-one, right? Every community organizer does a million one-on-ones. And we were unpacking them to see their centrality in community organizing. Dr. Rami Nashashibi, that guy, spoke about the role of faith in organizing a little bit last year, and he'll pick that up with our panelists tonight. We are exceptionally blessed to have Rami here. With his deep experience in organizing, as I think all of you know, he's the founding executive director of Iman, the Inner City Muslim Action Network. And he's also been, through that work, involved for a long time in interreligious engagement, building bridges for ways that transform our communities. In addition to that, he has an impressive scholarship in the sociology of religion, especially related to Islam. And he has then beautiful ways in which he brings those worlds together. And that's what he's doing with us and for us tonight. So would you welcome and say thank you with me to Dr. Rami Nashashibi.
Thank you, Rachel. We are all very extraordinarily gifted and grateful to have such a blessed and gifted person that could help in so many ways put the pieces together for us, as she is doing so often throughout the semester. Tonight, we will engage in a conversation. I feel very fortunate, and in full transparency, some of you will quickly find out that I'm using this as an excuse to get people together that I've been trying to have tea with, although I live and work with. You all know the phenomena of literally living alongside and working with people, but never really quite finding as much time as you would like to engage in the type of conversations that are hopefully will happen here tonight. And in many ways, that's what we'll be doing with three extraordinary individuals, organizers, each of whom I've just been very influenced by, touched by, and inspired by in their own unique ways. Now, before we embark upon a conversation that we will invite all of you to participate in, we thought, again, in keeping with the spirit of what we've been trying to impress upon all of you, and certainly many of you have come to these workshops with your own experience with organizing and are not unfamiliar with the one-to-ones. Last week, we actually had a version of what we've done in some of our organizing modules that quickly accelerate what a typical organizer would do in one-to-ones, which would take up time to get to a deeper level of conversation. If you recall what we did when we broke out, we started with asking you to ask your partner about a very deep question about, number one, if your life was a book, right? What would it be called and why? To engage with what many organizers are always attempting to help shape and uncover and be informed by, which is essentially people's stories. People's stories really are at the essence of who they are, particularly in their public capacities. And in many ways, organizers spend an inordinate amounts of time working with, engaging, being informed by, informing other people's stories. And in that process, again, the intersection with faith, as many of us also have had direct experience, think about the story as very a sacred terrain. We mentioned from, at least in the Muslim tradition, the idea of God as a sacred storyteller. And we mentioned the moment in Quranic revelation about the beginning of the Surah Yusuf, the chapter of the story Joseph, where it begins by saying, we reveal to you the best of stories. And in fact, the interesting thing about that is that that story, as I mentioned last week, came at a moment in the life of the Prophet Muhammad when he was in desperate need of a beautiful, riveting, inspiring story, right? It came at a moment where in the life biography of the Prophet Muhammad called Sanat al-Huzn, the year of sadness. He had lost his wife, he had lost his protector, he had been stoned by children who he had loved and was attempting to engage. And so he was really feeling on the margins, and this extraordinary story of a transcendent life story of Joseph, one that's familiar to many of you from the Bible, is told in one setting to the Prophet Muhammad. Now, in our context, our stories are also ways in which we get to know one another and get to know our communities and our struggles, the way we've related to issues. So tonight, in that spirit, again, I'd like us to break up, before we even get an opportunity to hear from our distinguished guests, to break up into one-to-ones for a short period of time, 10 or so minutes, and we'll let you know. And we also thought it would be, again, be very fitting to think about a one-to-one that rotates around some extraordinary things happening right now as we gather, things that we couldn't have anticipated when we first scheduled, not least of which is the president talking right now about an initiative, an executive initiative that in many ways speaks to a profound struggle within organizing worlds for close to a decade, comprehensive immigration reform. And on the other side of the country, are not far, are much closer to us in Ferguson, we are still awaiting the verdict of a jury around, again, another very polarizing and nationally resonant case. So what I'd like us to do in this short period of time, before then we'll get an opportunity to hear from our organizers, and I'll introduce them to you, is to break up, introduce yourself to someone that you do not know or have not met or had a chance to do a one-to-one with. And in light of those two cases, one, this really representing the pain, the struggle, the trauma of millions of undocumented people and their aspirations for relief and justice. And on the other side of the equation, a case that represents, in many communities, not just years, not just decades, but even centuries of trauma when it comes to authority and it comes to violence and it comes to justice and issues of race. when we think about those two cases that are before us, and we think about how does our personal stories, the stories of our loved ones, our families, those who we know in our inner circles that have been touched by those two cases in one capacity or the other. So if you break up and perhaps consider that as part of a point of departure. So we'll give you 10 minutes or so, and we'll go at it. And you can certainly break up into some of the tables here, or better yet, if you can just simply, assort yourselves in the seats here, so it'll be less cumbersome when we get back to the panel conversation. Panelists to join us on stage, and again, I'm sorry to cut the one-to-one short. It's always difficult to abruptly end, but as most organizers will always tell you, what we hope to always demonstrate that there's power in being intentional and deliberate about the opportunity of sitting with one another, hearing their stories, engaging them around the type of issues, and just finding who's in the community, who you're working with. So I'm going to ask my panelists to sit down. Go ahead, take a seat. And I'll introduce them briefly, and we'll plunge into a conversation. I have some official bios, but typically I'm going to kind of go a little more off what I know from each of you. So, again, we are very, very blessed and honored to have with us tonight, and for many reasons, I'm just very grateful. Not least of which, these three people are extraordinarily busy, doing many things, night and day, and at the same time, taking care of tremendous amounts of family needs and communities, and I know that about each of them. Pastor Ron just drove up from Springfield to join us and just came directly from Springfield. So to have this group here this evening and to be able to engage in this conversation is a treat. On the far left, we have Pastor Ron Taylor. He is currently the executive director of the United Congress of Community and Religious Organizations, which is a multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious alliance of communities of color that are organizing around a grassroots human rights framework to deal with everything from criminal justice reform to immigration. Pastor Ron has been serving now in that capacity for the last couple of years. Has it been that long?
No, it's
only been
not a year yet.
Not a year yet. But he has been working with the United Congress since its inception. Before that, as an organizer at Target Area Development Corporation, a organizing entity based in Auburn, Gresham, out of the Ambassadors for Christ that kind of emerged out of extraordinary leadership connected with the Ambassadors for Christ on 79th and Ashland. It's where I first met Pastor Ron, and we were doing organizing around criminal justice work then in a coalition called Developing Justice Coalition at the time. So, and again, so he's not only a seasoned organizer, he's also pastor of a church called the Disciples for Christ. That is, its congregation still based in Oakland. Yeah. And he has those of us who have been had the fortune of working and organizing with Pastor Ron know that he not only is an effective organizer, he's also very thoughtful, very insightful person when it comes to thinking about the intersections of faith, organizing, and very immediate issues that are confronting various communities. And so, thank you, Pastor Ron. Let's give it up for him and welcome him with us. To his right is the executive director of the Southwest Organizing Project, Jeff Bartow. Again, in full disclosure, I said in the beginning, these are people that I work with who have been mentors in many ways. Jeff has been a mentor not only to me, but to many, many organizers across the city of Chicago. He has over 25 years of intense experience in community organizing. He's an organizer's organizer. I'm old. And not just because he's getting up there in age, but because you will talk to anyone from major entities across the city. Jeff has simply been exposed to that before he worked, before he was executive director of Southwest Organizing Project, an organizing entity that also I'm connected to. Iman is a member organization of, and as are many other churches, synagogues, and mosques that are situated in the larger Southwest Side, Marquette Park, Chicago Lawn, West Lawn communities. Before that, Jeff was in CICERO and doing extraordinary interfaith and interreligious organizing there. And has, again, had every experience from everything from the sanctuary movement, working with asylum seekers and from Central America to exposure and access to organizing in all its flavors. And again, for many of us who've been in the field, perhaps one of the, no exaggeration, one of the most thoughtful people about both organizing, the tradition, and has helped push many of us who to think about the organizing within a context that really speaks very specifically to our own experiences. And so, again, it's a tremendous honor having Jeff here this evening. And last but not least, Shoshanah Yehudah, who, I said that right? Good. Shoshanah is also now an organizer with the Southwest Organizing Project. She's also a member of a synagogue that is, again, a very kind of home-based synagogue for many of us on the southwest side of Chicago, Beth Shalom. I mentioned the synagogue and that history when I think we made reference to organizing traditions in places like Marquette Park. That synagogue was a designated sanctuary at the time when Rabbi Marks joined Martin Luther King for the march. And as we mentioned, it was a designated sanctuary because they never made it to the synagogue because of the extraordinarily fierce backlash that they faced that day as they went into the park. But the synagogue represents a tremendous tradition now led by Rabbi Fournier, and has been a very important institutional member. Shoshanah has worked in a number of areas around issues of education and around other forms of organizing with our communities. And again, we're very grateful that you're here this evening. So I'm just going to open it up to all three of you, and we can start with Pastor Ron. Pastor Ron, and I think I mentioned this to the three of you. Last week, if you weren't here, in thinking about this, in part, some of you know, we're having this conversation. Next semester, I'll be teaching a course, Community Organizing and Spiritual Practice. Like to think about it both as a theoretical course, but also historical one, but also as a practicum of sorts that gets us into the field and really thinking about campaigns. And, you know, when you look at the literature about the intersection of organizing and faith traditions, and the three of you can take issue with this or exception, I come away with a sense that faith has certainly many roles in organizing, but I kind of come away with three overarching ones, just from a cursory read of some of the literature on this. One is that organizing as a practice, as a professional practice, is seeped in and in many ways shaped by the values of faith traditions. Clearly, some of the major organizing networks across the country, PICO, still explicitly inserted in their mission statement. You get a sense of that faith values, and particularly here, Judeo-Christian faith values, right, as at least understood, help to shape the field of organizing, the idea of organizing. So that's one. I think, important role that faith has played. The second is, I suggested, and just thinking, the very practical place of organizing, faith congregations, congregation-based organizing, thinking about the type of spaces that faith institutions provide for organizers, a base, a constituency, an ability to mobilize. Until this day, I think we can still see that in effect, that faith institutions, irrespective of where, you know, the challenge of many faith institutions today are their changing role of many faith institutions continue to play that role. And then thirdly, I think the idea that, again, organizations like PICO and other, I think, are very explicit about, that organizing then allows faith traditions, whether the congregation or the very faith identity of communities, to be relevant in the world, to be, organizing serves as a force to revitalize faith communities. So this is kind of this interesting dialectic, if you will, between the actual faith community and organizing, and the role organizing plays for the faith community, and what faith communities help serve for the actual organizers. So those are just three kind of sets of ideas. Now, what I'm interested in from your experiences, and really specifically your experiences and observations and your encounters and your thoughts about organizing, is maybe to open up with some reflections about those or other things about the where you've seen faith and intersect with organizing for you, where you've seen it complicated, when it's been issues for mobilization, and occasionally when perhaps it's been issues that have actually been obstacles in some cases, and, you know, open up with some thoughts, and then maybe I'll ask some questions, and then we'll very quickly turn it over to the brothers and sisters gathered here this evening. So, Pastor Ron, do you mind beginning?
Sure. Certainly, when it comes to my values, I always do a gut check of my actions with my values, because I honestly believe that with our faith, we should be leading with our values. And so for me personally, organizing provided definitely a platform for me to live those values out in the world. The role that I play in my congregation is one of teacher, but that's really not where action takes place. It's where teaching takes place. And somehow we have to find a way to move people away from the center of where the teaching takes place and intersect those values into the real world. And so organizing for me, it made everything that I learned in the church very, very real. And I brought a paper up here because there's a verse that I really love, that I feel that really kind of captures the essence of both my faith as well as what we do in organizing. It's a passage in Micah 6 and 8. And it's one of my favorite verses. And it basically says, the Lord has told you what is good. He has told you what he wants from you, to do what is right to other people, love being kind to others, and live humbly, obeying your God. And all of those qualities that are mentioned right there are qualities that I try to live my life by. I try to get a true understanding of what it really means to love people. You and I, we had this conversation maybe a couple of months ago, and I was sharing with you how that we have a very convoluted meaning of what love is. For me, I cannot separate love from what I do for a person. To me, it is the highest form of action that you can actually have toward another human being. Is when you love a human being. It's how you treat them, and it's the manner in which you treat them. And so those are my thoughts about the values. In organizing, once again, I found a way to really be able to live those values out. And one of the passages in the New Testament that I really love is one that talks about the Good Samaritan. And in the story of the Good Samaritan, those that are familiar with the difference of those different characters that's mentioned there, the Samaritan, the rabbi that walks by, the Levite, it was the Samaritan whose religion really was not mentioned, but whose action was placed at a higher level because he stopped to help someone who was beaten along the road. And he made the sacrifice to put him up in a hotel, paid for all the expenses that was incurred as a result of that. And to me, that's really in a very real way what we do in organizing. I think that we help the helpless, and we try to help instill a voice for the voiceless and people who can, through systemic means, have a voice. We try to change those dynamics so that those individuals have a voice and so that they can be heard. And so this is, these are my initial thoughts.
Thank you. Jeff?
Wow. Listening to what you said, I thought of a conversation I had in Spokane, Washington, about 10 years ago with a brilliant organizer, an elder, a man named Dick Harmon. We were talking about organizing in public schools. And he said, yeah, but what's the poetic? And I thought, well, that's a damn good question. And it made me alive to what's so distinctive about what we're calling faith traditions, because there's clearly a narrative line, you know? And historically, our faith traditions have been spaces within which we could name grief, we could name anger, and we could live with hope without losing any of those dimensions. And I find organizing so important. It's very similar, I think, to what Ron laid out, and I would probably pull the same passage as one of my favorite passages in biblical texts. It's so simple, so succinct. But power is central to organizing. And to me, power is related to action because that's the site where it's tested. And I find our scriptures very straightforward about the struggles and contradictions inherent in addressing power. And I find when we engage with power, our bodies are implicated. Questions of collective relationship is central. And we move out of our heads and into spaces where sin and redemption are real. I think the Good Samaritan story, for me, my relationship to that story is, what do you do when you come on a body that's profoundly injured and you know it's not the only one? Or what if you're there before the guys show up? How do you confront violence collectively? And I think organizing is located in that space where healing is with the most vulnerable people, the people that may be at the side of the road, as they engage with you about who they are, what their story is, and we fight to transform that situation. Today, community is a word that's used as a description of a geography rather than as an achievement.
Right.
And organizing is a space where there's an opportunity to experience what I would name the grace of community. It comes and goes. So I concur with your 3 points. I think that they make sense. I think they get more enfleshed when we tell stories.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks. Shoshanah.
Well, I'm newer to the organizing tradition. I've been with the Southwest Organizing Project for 5 years. And Jeff will tell you that I was a bit resistant to the notion of organizing and its real impact. And I would say personally, I have grown to value organizing as I have deepened my faith. And being of the Judaic faith, I think it's the spirit of Judaism that connects to organizing. For me, as I think about Moshe Rabbeinu and him being an organizer, and sort of, one of the concepts that we talk about in organizing is the world as it is and sort of moving towards the world as it should be, but living in that tension. And that's the story of the Exodus. That's, taking a risk to leave comfort, taking a risk to do something that in your heart you should do, but you're tempted to stay in isolation. You're tempted to stay where you are. And then going through the wilderness and living in that tension to get to that place of milk and honey, to get to that promised land. And so I am always seeking in my own congregation to really agitate movement. Because in Judaism, it's really easy, in any faith tradition, it's easy to get caught in the text, caught in knowing the language, knowing the Hebrew, knowing the traditions, and it becomes rote. But as we really think about what it means to observe the Shabbat, and what it means to observe the traditions, what it means to honor the Exodus, it has to move you to action. But we have to bring a spirit to that tradition, as opposed to just being tradition for tradition's sake. And knowing the text isn't enough. Recently, we had a 96th anniversary for Beth Shalom, and one of our rabbis from New York spoke about Noah, and it was the parsha for that week, and he spoke about sort of the ark landing. It's on dry land now, and now it's time for us to get off the ark, because we're tempted to stay on. We want to stay on and be safe. We want to stay on and be in isolation. We want to not take the risk of going out and seeing what we can make of the world now. And so our goal is always to get off, get off and be in action and step out of isolation. So for me, from a Judaic faith perspective, but then also from an African-American perspective, I'm an African-American Jewish woman. And so I bring all of that into the context of organizing and my own history, from a historical perspective, from a family perspective, and from a religious perspective.
Well, I'm going to ask this very powerful opening reflections. I'm going to begin with a couple questions to start shifting us into some of the conversations about some of our, again, engagement with lived experiences and some of the more stickiness and occasional messiness, that tension that you spoke of, Shoshanah. Of course, organizers constantly talk about living in, thriving in, and being very real about the world as is, as we aspire towards moving towards the world as it could be, should be. So I want to pick up on, maybe start with you, Shoshanah. The word you used was resistance. Now, interestingly, there have been lots of different reasons why various communities have, and individuals, both in our individual capacities, community capacities sometimes, had different forms of resistance to different models of organizing. I want to cite two and then get each of your thoughts and reflections on this. One, I think that gets mentioned a lot in the literature and is certainly kind of consistent with our experiences and my experiences, is that religious communities sometimes take exception to some of the language. So although there's this interesting sense, right, that we're agreeing with that, much of organizing values, at least as constructed by some of the more accessible organizing language that's talked about now, comes from some of the values. There are terms like self-interest and power and issues and the modalities of organizing trainings, right, by conducted in certain ways that sometimes faith communities find very uncomfortable. And not simply uncomfortable in kind of a positive agitation way, but in some cases antithetical to who they are, to things that run contrary to some religious traditions and values. And I think be interested in hearing some of your thoughts about when and where you've wrestled with that, when you thought it's actually valid, when you thought it was simply a shifting a frame of interpretation, right? And then the second thing, Shoshanah, you raised also was the issue you alluded right as you close, of course, of your personal story grounded as a Jewish African-American woman, right? And the issue of race and gender. Both of those things, certainly people who have sometimes organized in the context of race and the tradition, both in the black community, sometimes, Jeff, you and I were just alluding to it earlier, sometimes a distinction that what's come out of black community organizing is distinct from other organizing, and that sometimes the conversations of race as they intersect with faith, although faith is sometimes a kind of broad umbrella, but we see that kind of, there is that intersection, and occasionally the charge that organizing isn't sometimes as attuned to, right, the racial nuances of our experiences. Gender, the kind of a literature about, sometimes organizers talk about the distinction between public and private, right? And we talk about, but of course within gender, feminist movements for decades now, you've had the private is is very much the political, right? The personal is the political. How and what I do with my body in terms of the governance of just women's lives within even very domesticated circumstances were fraught with a bunch of political implications. And so the idea of the fact, that meta charge that sometimes existed at one point, that this was both white, this was both often very much about men, right, organizing in certain congregations, that has elicited different types of resistances, to use your word, Shoshanah. How have you experienced some of that, dealt with that, both in your own life, in your own organizing work? Have you seen that changed? And just interested maybe in your reactions to that.
I have seen it changed. My resistance came very much from sort of religious teachings of humility, of peace, of, in organizing, you have to have a little bit of anger in order to act. And so it's the struggle with, do I really want to be angry? Do I really want to retreat and just be in peace with my own interests? That is my interest. That is my self-interest. And how does that personal self-interest align with a public interest of acting? Because I want to elicit a cold anger about an issue. And so that was the tension for me, was a personal tension of where do I stand in that tension. And so for me, it was the resistance of oftentimes my congregation to act that sparked a flame in me, to want to push them towards relevancy, push them towards, being a part of a movement, being in a community where there's much to be done and we're not doing anything. And so that was, a part of the change for me, and it's coming out of that resistance. And then, like I said, just really drawing on the stories, drawing on my own faith, and really seeing in the Torah this action. There was movement. There was movement. There was transition happening. There was Abraham leaving his home, in search of the oneness of God, on a journey where he didn't know where that journey would lead him, but he acted on faith. And so that for me was a part of, coming out of that. In terms of the intersect of race and gender and religion, I'm a 70s baby. And so religion for me was very much socio-political for my family, because they were a part of that Black Jewish movement of just reclaiming a history. And part of reclaiming that history was resistance against racism and discrimination, and wanting to reclaim a heritage that was rich. And so that's what I grew up with. And then also growing up being African American and Jewish, and being told, how can you be Jewish? Because you're African American. And so that is a part of the history that also gives me energy for the organizing work, because that's the resistance that I had to confront most of my life as a person of Judaic faith. And just now getting comfortable with that. Just now, as a, close to 40, becoming more comfortable with accepting that action is a part of my faith. I can't just sit back, learn, and read Torah, but not act. It just seems contradictory to me. So that's how I think about it.
Jeff?
I don't know where to begin.
There was a lot, so anywhere you're comfortable.
Maybe you could pick up again just in terms
Sure.
of...
I was getting at, again, the code word here that Shoshanah raised, organizers and organizing does encounter all different types of resistances. And the history of it has unfolded in different ways. And these religious communities have the issues around race, around gender, and different communities as the experience of organizing has emerged in a city like Chicago. And you've lived that in very real ways. Right. You've seen some of that.
Got it, yeah. Quite honestly, I was thinking about Shoshana's response, and I would say to you that whatever the evolution of your feelings about your relationship to anger, you never have refused to confront, right? I think that's a pretty consistent quality, and I name it because on the road to knowing action, confrontation is really, really central. And I think you've just known that instinctively. And I don't know, for what it's worth. And the impact has been humbling, infuriating, but transforming for the people you've confronted, I think. And I think it's worth naming, that's all. Mm-hmm. You guys know the root of the word confront? It means with face, which gets back to what we were talking about right at the very beginning, about the importance of individual meetings. We all know that 90% of communication is the body. And then we've got this, right? It's just irreplaceable. You know, social networking, all that kind of stuff has its place, but it's secondary. Theologians talk about how their work is kind of secondary to the primary actions of the worshiping communities. Absolutely true in organizing, too. I find the distinction between self-interest and selfishness in that conversation empirically has been more in my head than in the people I've worked with. The way to address any notion with anyone, I mean, and I'm going to appeal to y'all's experience here too, that someone is resistant to, if it's a concept, is to look for a space where there's common ground and try to get a sense of what you can trust each other around. And then you broach, well, why do you think this way about that notion, right? Why do you think self-interest implies selfishness? And often the answer is really interesting. My most powerful conversations about it have been with people outside of the North American organizing tradition. And it's kind of along the lines, why the hell do you talk about self-interest? Why aren't you talking about solidarity? I remember coming back from a national training in 1993, very excited to tell my wife about what was involved in it. And I went into a pretty elaborate conversation about the stuff we learned. And she asked me one sentence. She said, would people there give their lives for each other? She came out of the context of armed struggle in Central America. In any case, I was given a new context for this conversation. So I find it more an opportunity than an obstacle.
Pastor Ron?
Yeah, I'm also thinking about the two answers that was just given. But I can relate to the question because we definitely confronted this issue when we initially had organizing training and the use of self-interest was used. Usually, when certain words are used, those words trigger a certain reaction, and sometimes it's really a matter of semantics, because I really believe that what organizers is really getting at, and probably could be rephrased so that we would be more comfortable with it in our faith, is you have to tap into what motivates people. And because if it doesn't motivate people, then it's not going to move them. And so what we seek to do is we seek to, and the word was used earlier, agitate or move people to action. So people are not going to be moved to action if it's not something that they feel motivated or passionate about. So we use the word passions, we use the word motivations, we don't use the word self-interest. But I think that you really kind of sort of tapping into some of the same things. And did I have a problem with it when I heard it? I did. I really did, because as soon as I heard the word self-interest, I'm thinking about selfishness. And of course, one of the things that we believe in our faith is that if our faith is genuine according to what is written in Scripture, then it moves us to think about other than yourself. It moves you to think about others. It moves you to be others-centered as opposed to self-centered. And so I think that's probably some of the problem that initially I had with the term as it was used. But quite honestly, when I look at models that are out there, and I think you kind of touched on that as well, that when you look at organizing models, I don't feel I have to be faithful to a model. I feel when you look at even the history of organizing, if you go back to look at the Civil Rights Movement, and if you go back to look at what Gandhi did, they did something that was quite different than what was done before. And I think that they was true to who they were. I believe in operating in your strengths. That's what I believe in. And if I try to be anything other than, or operate in other than the strengths that was given to me, it's going to be a tough road to hoe. And so that's what I believe in. And so I think in operating in your strengths, you're going to sometimes develop models that may look different than what was done. But if it's effective at making change, that's what we seek. We seek to change systems. We seek to change what is going on in our communities, and whatever it takes in order to affect that change, whatever model needs to be used. When you look at United Congress, for example, I think the way that we have approached organizing has been somewhat different, and it has been noted that it's been somewhat different, and that doesn't bother me. I think we have to be true to the mission that we're trying to accomplish, and we have to be true to the gifts that we've been given. And so that's kind of the way I kind of operate. Even when it comes to my ministry, I don't try to model my ministry after someone else's ministry. I try to model my ministry after the strengths that's been given to me. And as long as I walk in that, I think I'll be fine.
Jeff, did you want to say something like that?
Yeah, I just want to put a good word in for self-interest and paying attention to it.
Sure.
It's the world as it is, and when we want to understand what somebody else cares about, it can be very important. If that person is making decisions that affect the people you're working with, I'm interested in what they're interested in. And I'm interested in the people I'm working with and what they care about. So I would also say that sometimes I've been deliberate in spaces where I think I will encounter resistance about pushing the notion of self-interest precisely because it's going to create some kind of stir. You get what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
I want to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
I think, and I think the interesting tension between those two strategies that I think all of us have deployed at one point or the other, being deliberate, as you mentioned, Shoshanah, going into our spaces and agitating and getting people to recognize that you are moved by issues that you're invested in,
Yes.
and the way you relate to the actual etymological definition of the term, self among others, right? You are constructed that way. We all move that way. I think the other flip side of it, Jeff, probably gets to something that has less to do with the technical definition of the term and more to, I think, this larger set of conversations about what that model of organizing is associated with or disconnected from a tradition. In other words, I don't think it's not just self-interest, it's a whole bunch of other things that, quite frankly, doesn't fit here, that type of conversation.
Yeah, but I was really moved by what Ron said about moving out of your strength. I think my faith, I grew up in the Christian tradition, I think it really came alive for me in Central America, because it no longer seemed fantastic. It seemed like the impossible happens. I felt like magical realism was realism. And I began to discover the texts of our faith tradition are rooted in the world as it is, in the tension between the two worlds. And those that would argue the way you're suggesting, I think are maybe aligned a lot more with the way the world should be, living in the world as it should be. I push back. I mean,
Yeah,
I could be wrong.
I think it's partly that. I think it's not so much the disagreement with that, I think, very powerful paradigm, because I think that when explained that way, I think in many of our traditions, that's resonant. I think what becomes an obstacle in very real terms on the south side of Chicago, among organizations, and getting back to your experience, Black Hebrews, Nation of Islam, Imam Muhammad's community, that's not the way we organize, son, right? Nah, you're just bringing, and so it's no longer a conversation about this very real concept that's probably very resonant with the way in which they engaged faith, and now it has to do with models that have been, boundaries have sometimes been constructed up against. I want to end, because I definitely want to invite everyone here into a conversation. I guess very succinctly, if I could ask maybe one last reflection. If each of you can just reflect on most inspiring moment, validating moment, moments that you can think of in recent memory, and alongside that, one of the most unnerving, overwhelming, if you will, disheartening moments in the field. And we've all had plenty of those, and I think in retrospect learn as much from them as we do the more inspiring spaces. So I think it's just be interesting, particularly in the context of this conversation around faith. Who wants to jump in? Shoshanah, can you start? And if you want to meditate on that, I could open it up to the floor, and you could chime in when you want on that. There's something to think about. Anyone else? Oh, yeah.
Because of the competition we have this evening of, a president giving a major announcement and other things, we decided we want to tape it so that people can see it who couldn't be here tonight. So if you wouldn't mind stating your question into the microphone, we can pick that up on tape as well. Questions?
Hi, my name is Christopher Wims, and I work for the Center for Faith and Service at McCormick. And one of the things that we're trying to do is interreligious dialogue. And I know how to speak to other Christians about faith and service. But calling on other faith traditions to serve and come along with you in sort of a singular way, that we're all doing this for one go, that's a little bit more difficult for me to grasp in my head how to do that. So I'd like to know how you all have sort of dealt with that argument.
I would say that I think of them all as coming out of the Abrahamic tradition, right? And so that for me builds a connection between all three. And I think more than religion, more than specifics around what we do, just drawing on how does what you do make who you are, who you're being in those moments. And drawing on the spirit of our faith, as opposed to the religious traditions and the differences. So what's similar is that we come out of the same traditions, really. When I think about, sometimes Jews are offended when Jesus is spoke of, but I think of Jesus as a rabbi. Jesus was a teacher. And though, the way that I relate to Jesus is different than the way Christians relate to Jesus, there's a relationship there. And so I think just, I'd like to draw on commonality and the connections that we all have to Abraham and the beginning of it all, right? The creator. So.
That's an excellent answer, and exactly, I think, how we've tackled interfaith relations right within United Congress, having Muslims, having Christians that come together on common issues, was work. It was work involved in that, and I don't want to sugarcoat it like it's not work, because we talked earlier about confronting issues, and so one of the things that we did very early on in United Congress, we created what we call a safe space, where we could come and we can really talk about what we feel, what we think, and in that safe space, it wasn't about judging what the other person had to say. It was more about listening, actively listening to what they had to say. And those were very difficult times, because sometimes things would be said and you want to react to it. And you had to really learn how to kind of take a step back, and more so, I think, getting to what Shoshanah was just mentioning, getting to the spirit of where a person is coming from. Because in what I believe, there is the letter of the law, and you keep referring to that, and I want to comment on that, because I think she's right on target there, because there's the letter of the law, and then there's the spirit of the law. If you remember, Jesus was very critical of the Pharisees, because he said, when it comes to the traditions, the rituals, you don't have any problems. You follow those to the letter. He said, but you're missing the spirit of the law. He said, the things like love and justice and mercy is absent from your actions. And so this is, I think, where the commonality would come in, because when you really look at our faith traditions, all of us seek to do those things. We seek to do justice. We seek to show mercy. We seek to make the world a better place to live in. And so we try to tap into those things, and we look for those commonalities, the values that we share in our faith, and we connect with that, and not focusing in so much on the differences.
Jeff, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think I look at it a little differently. I'm interested in individual conversations with others where our felt relationship to being alive is expressed. And when that kind of exchange happens, irregardless of the faith context the person is operating in, we're touched by each other, just by definition. I'm more interested in conversations that lead me to understand who's more likely to have my back, humanly. And within that context, to learn how that gets named by the other. And it gets named differently. I'm wary of this distinction between spirit and letter because I've heard people describe it as the letter all the way down, and it's a shortcut to talk spirit, letter, that kind of thing. Letter all the way down might mean a profound and wide-ranging accountability to the full resonance of a term, rather than leaving the term behind. What we're getting at is a shared notion of something mattering, right? And one tradition expresses it in a contrast between letter and spirit. We all know the notion. You get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I think also, and I'm interested in others' thoughts, just from our experiences, for me, the most powerful moments, I think it goes back to what you were saying about Guatemala, Jeff, about kind of being on the ground. It takes those spaces where you begin to think about your tradition. We all know this about all of our religious traditions. In Islam, there's the science of asbab wa nuzul, right, which is kind of the occasion of revelation, right? What was happening in really particular, sticky, messy, real life times, right? The kind of all the historical contingencies that then allowed for something that was still very universal and transcendent, but also very particular to come. And, you know, I think moments for me that have helped to illustrate the power of a interreligious engagement, in many cases, have come out of the work that I've done with many of you collectively, and I've seen together very real moments where, quite frankly, although yes, we have these shared traditions and there's lots of similarities, but in those moments, those conversations aren't even that necessary, right? It goes back to the kind of concept of getting your back. When we responded, one example, and I cited this before, and Jeff, I think you were just out of town that day, but we had a lot of organizers there from SWOP, and Beth Shalom was there. There was a homicide on our block. I think I've talked about this before. Right in front of Fairfield Academy, and you know, unfortunately, we all get inured to homicides in our communities. We're way too many of them. This day, though, I got a call. Maybe this was two days before Good Friday, and it was a 37-year-old father of 3 that had been working in the same pizzeria for 25 years, right, delivering pizza. That had just, you know, and it was, and you know, you get these tragic stories, but just something about this story, and I think the fact that it was in the middle of the day, he was literally dodging a bullet, and got hit, ran a block, and died right there, right on our block, right? And I think there was just something about this idea of power, right, that sometimes, again, is a problematic term with religious communities, but it really boils down to, for me, it was a life-giving force. Are we going to act? Or are we going to sit and wallow in it? Because I was ready to wallow in it. I was ready. I had the same experience when I came home once and kids shot. You know, you get this all the time. What can you do? So, but we moved, right? And I think it was a call with the rabbi, and it was a call with the father, Tony, and then some of the leaders who were on the block that pushed us to move. And we eventually decided that the stations of the cross that are done on Good Friday in the Catholic tradition, which would kind of walk right by that spot, that Father Tony said, look, we will deliberately, we'll stop at this space. This will be one of the stations of the cross, the 8th or the 7th, I can't remember which one. It was a Friday, so how about Muslims, instead we'll get people from the community, we'll do the Salat, we'll do the actual Jummah, right, on the spot. And Rabbi Finier agreed to do the sunset prayer, right, I think right as we would lead into Shabbat, right, there that day. Or actually earlier, one of the prayers, because we did it around Jummah, so it had been one of the earlier prayers, so we do the prayer. So, but all that to say, here you had all 3 religious communities There wasn't a lot of conversation about discussions of similarities and differences, quite frankly, but no one needed that. And what was powerful is everyone stayed and observed the prayer of the distinct community. Like, they didn't have to shift up the Stations of the Cross and say, right now what we're doing is, and Jummah, we didn't have to give a lot of explanation to it. And there were Black, Latino, Arab, Muslims, Jews, and Christians standing right there, and they were all absorbing it with the members of the family, right, who were right there. And for me, that moment just kind of underscored, I think, a lot of the power of what we're talking about, right?
It's a beautiful example.
Right? And I think it's that experience. Whatever the Jewish community was doing, whatever they were saying in their prayers, quite frankly, however it resonated or didn't resonate, I appreciated it, right? What the Station of the Cross, however I relate to Jesus or I don't in my tradition, I felt it that moment, right? I felt it. The kids felt it, right? And I think the Jummah prayer and just the observation of it, and it all seemed to really speak. Now, the challenge is those moments don't always happen. You have to be told, how do you capture the essence of those moments and bring that back to square one in spaces about dialogue that can then lead and sustain those types of opportunities?
And I think that speaks to a level of trust that develops between, obviously Rabbi Fournier, Father Tony, you, that's developed over years. And it's developed through relating to each other and being a part of collective action multiple times and modeling something for people. Even though they don't know, most of the people there didn't know what Rabbi was saying. He's speaking in Hebrew. But because there was a dignity and respect sort of gleaming from the relationship and the presence of all three that could create that space where, it's a power, even though we don't, our faith traditions are different. And so I think that develops through trust and through modeling something different. And it is a unique space. I have not been in many spaces where that happens. And I would say Southwest Side is definitely, for me, in terms of what I've seen, and is unique in that way, that we've been able to develop that in the community.
Affirming, I'm going to take the prerogative
sure.
of a question.
Yeah.
Affirming all those things, right? The power of the commonality within different religious traditions, even beyond the traditions of Abraham, Sarah, and Hajar. And those transformative moments where the religions absolutely are able to articulate in their very particularity the common humanity and the common goal and the common purpose. I want to complicate it a little bit. Especially because community organizing is so focused on stories, on understanding and sharing each other's stories. Absolutely. We implicate each other in our stories. Organizing today with Jews and Muslims has an enormous elephant-sized story that is stuck in the room. Either you're addressing what's happening in the Middle East or you're not, but we are implicated in each other's stories in a huge and important way. Organizing between Christians and Jews, the stories that you lift up that I know are so central and so important and so beautiful within Christian tradition also implicate me. I am the biological, spiritual, philosophical, and religious descendant of the Pharisee. And the New Testament version of the Pharisee I don't believe is true. It is polemical. And there is spirit in Pharisaic Judaism. And the denigration of the law implicates my story and my relationship to ritual. Or the Good Samaritan story, another beautiful, transformative story. I look at it, you said you read it in a particular way about, you see the one guy in the gutter and what do you do about all the other people are sitting in the gutter. And I look at it and I see the Kohen, the priest, and the Levite implicated because Because they're supposed to be leaders in the community. They're supposed to be the Ramis and the Father Tonys and the Rabbi Funyes, and they walked by.
Right.
But it's not always read quite that way. Yeah. It's sometimes read the Samaritan's good, the Jew's bad, right? In that story, in that context. So even when, there is a question here, after my rant is winding down here. We're implicated in each other's stories. So my question is how, using the tools of community organizing, do we get beyond or agitate around or utilize those implications to move forward together?
Well, that's why I said, honestly, it's not always easy. Because even if someone is sharing something, just like I've been sharing, and people have private thoughts, and I can remember early on, quite frankly, over the years, I don't really recall ever having much of a religious discussion with Rami. What I got to know is Rami the person. And so when I talk about safe spaces, I'm not talking about safe spaces where we talk about religion. I'm talking about safe spaces where we talk about who we are. And so where I got comfortable with him early on, whereas I wasn't early on comfortable with Islam, I got to know him as a person. And those walls slowly started to come down. So when I talk about it not being easy, that's what I'm talking about, because we all have our own religious conceptions in the back of our head that have built up walls for building relationship with people. And it's hard, it's very hard for those walls to come down. I think for me personally, in hearing his story and what he went through, and I remember him very distinctly sharing about what he went through as a child, his Palestinian experience, and listening to that, I was able to connect the dots from him sharing his experience about what he went through with what African Americans go through every day. And we built a relationship based on that. So it really kind of aligns with what you were sharing as well. And so perhaps in some ways I may have been a little misunderstood in talking about what I said. But what I was really getting at is that sometimes we're so stuck in what we was taught that it's very difficult for us to let that down long enough to really get to know a person and build relationship.
I think what Pastor Ron said is really at the center of it. Organizing is about getting serious about the give and take of individual meetings for public relationship. It's about taking those relationships and involving the very people impacted in those communities by issues in doing that work. And it's about coming together, doing some people call it a power analysis. It's really a relational analysis. Who's related to who and who has the ability to make decisions and what's the dynamic involved. And then it's about research, action, and evaluation. And those are very specific kinds of things in this context. And each is reinforcing of the other. Organizing is an experiment in collective voice. And it's stepping into spaces where we succeed or we fail. And in either case, we assess, we evaluate what we've done. Not for abstraction, but for moving forward together. And I think the kind of breakthroughs that respect difference are more likely to happen in that context than in contexts that are divorced from spaces with the potential for common action. That's not an argument against the academy. It's simply saying that when we're wholly implicated in something, no pun intended, we're more likely to resonate with each other in the full sense of our distinctiveness and our commonality.
You know, one thing, Jeff, you said earlier that kind of, I'm thinking about again in the context of what you said, Rachel, was the comment that Adriana, your wife, initially challenged you with, kind of deflated your sense of giddiness after the first organizing training. Because I think that gets to another question I was asking earlier, quite frankly, right? Which is this idea that these variations of organizing models, right? Adriana kind of just put it on the table. You know, you had great relational meetings. Now, who's ready to die for one another, right? And it takes another, it's an agitation within an agitational framework, right? And I think what I've seen so powerful about organizing in Chicago, quite frankly, even over the last 15 years, is the willingness to embrace that and explore different models within the context of what works, but to expand the terrain to fit these different types of conversations. So it's no longer just a, you know, folks just talking about coming out of a kind of, you know, quite frankly, kind of a revolutionary experience, or coming out of the Black Power movement, Brown Power movements, Alinsky models, that there's lots of hybrid conversations happening. Now, what I relate to what you raised, Rachel, was kind of some of the stuff that we were doing with UCCRO, this idea of, which I think gets back to the relational piece, but is even more intentional about this idea of really creating trust, right? I mean, we spent, as you know, remember, when we were building these lines, so we literally, before we even attacked any coalition, any campaign around any issue, and many of us had already been working on campaigns, criminal justice and stuff, we very deliberately did not commit ourselves to any campaign for, I think, like good 3-4 years, right? It was really about getting up in each other's spaces, narrating our stories, and having to suffer occasionally through someone's story that is heartfelt, emotional, but is absolutely, utterly offensive. Now, outside of the context of religion, I remember one comical one which Patricia used to raise. She was talking about, you know, one of the things was kind of bringing a very typical Black Pentecostal community together with immigrants. You know, this was at a time where some of the marches were just beginning to jump off, and Patricia was talking. I won't say because he's a beautiful brother, but she so says like, you know, I want you to come visit our family and to my house, and we'll go to the jails and the prisons and visit your family, right? And Patricia's like, you know, the idea that every African American on the South Side had some family in prison, right? And being absolutely and completely, utterly insulted by that, as one should be, but at the same time, pushing on the immigrant, kind of this internal narrative of immigrants. You know, that's why those early conversations were very difficult, because we're very honest about kind of internal ideas of hegemony and who has perceptions of one another and how our stories of one another. And it gets even further complicated when you layer on these sets of because those religious references just become part of our ways in which people deploy authoritative aspects within our story. And they can be and are very demeaning. But it's one thing, what I saw happen without having to spell it out is something as simple as, you know, we've talked about it here intellectually, when someone closes a prayer in the name of Jesus, for instance, right? And we saw that happen very organically with really never having to raise that may make, it wasn't make the Muslims feel uncomfortable, even that may make Shamar, or Alia, or Rami, maybe let's find another way of still being true to who we are, right? And find a way of saying that. And we model that here at CTS a lot. But those ideas, I think, emerged very organically in these spaces that created enough room to be very vulnerable with one another and to say, and I think that's what, safe space sometimes is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but I think in the context of what I saw work that kind of grew out of this organizing model with UCCRO was safe space was the space to be able to really put a lot of that on the table and talk about it in a way that allowed us to really interrogate. Yes, that's very resonant and connected to you, but it's utterly offensive to us. And not only offensive, it's hurtful. And it speaks to the kind of pain that our communities have endured and quite frankly, we see you are a part of. But, and we talked about issues of Arab-Black relations and communities. I mean, we had a lot of those types of conversations. I think it created at least an opportunity to flesh some of that type of stuff out. Right.
Hey, I did think of a powerful moment in my organizing, SWOP's organizing. We did a lot of research and came up with what we thought was a very strong legislative proposal and presented it to the Speaker of the House, who had begun to see the impact. At that point, there were over 90 mortgage lending firms on 55th Street between Kedzie and Cicero, and from like 39th Street down to 79th Street. 90 of these firms just churning out loans. He saw the graveness of the problem, and we worked in that space and came up with some very strong legislation. But we agreed that we were not going to do this like we usually did it. We were not going to talk to our normal allies about what we were doing. We knew that they probably wouldn't disagree, or that was our working assumption. It angered some people near the end of session when the bill was introduced, and that's when we talked to people. We told them about it. Most people said, I wish I had thought of it. Some people said that's not good process, which was true. But the law passed, and we were held up, as the little group that beat the banks. And about 10 months later, the other shoe landed as the mortgage lending industry began its response right at the point when the law went into effect. And because of the legacy of the Southwest Side, that was the angle that we were attacked on. They literally said, you may remember this, Ron, that the reason we fought the mortgage brokers was because we were racist and we wanted to deny access to people of color to a neighborhood that at that point was about 70, 80% a neighborhood of color, but didn't matter really. And I'll be really honest, I was betwixt and between. It's sort of like I had made my own bed, now I had to lay in it. You get what I'm saying? We had done this kind of on our own. As actually you, Rami, I had a conversation with, and we talked about Target because we're allies. And we talked about Acorn, who was still alive then. And I don't know if you actually said, why don't we engage them in this, but I think you did. But the back and forth, the gist of it was, I did not want to put them in the crosshairs of the mortgage lending industry. And I think you had a conversation with Patricia, but what was so moving to me was the call I got from the Target area organization saying, we want to have your back. Now that was built on probably at that point 5-6 years of relationship, but that was a big deal for us because we're multicultural. And the ability we had at that point for spokespersons who were African American to talk about the worth of what we had done was limited, very limited. And Target actually assigned people to take the lead on a bunch of radio interviews whose advertisements were paid for by the mortgage lending industry. I mean, it was a very, very ugly kind of scene. But the fact that organizations in the city came and said, we're going to stand with you guys, was pretty amazing. So it was a powerful thing for me.
Well, Amy.
Hi, my name is Amy. I've been listening to all of you speak tonight about relationship and the importance of organizing as this one-on-one kind of connection and building trust and building relationship across many different divisions and also commonalities. And what I've heard from each of you is that it's a very important part of your work to create those relationships and to have those moments of connection. And I was wondering if you could share with us what it is that motivates you and drives you to be a leader in creating that kind of connection and having those one-on-ones, rather than sort of being within the group, but to actually go out and create those dialogues and those conversations, and what also gives you the courage to do that, to go out and do that with people who, you know, might not have your back, or who you might not know, or who might have very hurtful and painful experiences with, but you still are trying to build a relationship with.
Amy, that's a great question. I'm going to also use that question as kind of maybe a last set of thoughts from our panelists, because I want to make sure we end on time and give Rachel an opportunity to bring it all together.
Yeah, that is a great question. And it's one that just had me self-reflecting for a moment, because by nature, I think I'm a good-natured person by nature, easy to get along with, but not one who is going to be outgoing. And so the whole concept of building relationship in one-on-one for me sometimes can be rather uncomfortable, because by nature, that's not who I am. But what I have seen, because we talked about power tonight, is that the power is in building those relationships. Rami referred earlier to us first being exposed to each other in developing Justice Coalition. But we worked on common issues in developing Justice Coalition, but we did not build relationship. We didn't build relationship until we took that space that Rami talked about in United Congress deliberately for 3-4 years and didn't work on any issue, because we understood that in order to build power that is going to be sustaining over time, the relationship component has to be there. And so it was during that process that I saw the power of really building relationship, and it really made me a little bit more comfortable and gave me a little bit more courage to step outside of my comfort zone, because I understood that in order to really be able to do this effectively, it's the one-on-ones, it's the relationship building component that had to be present.
Thanks, Pastor.
I think in my case, I was really interested in being located in a space where I could live, or where I could live a reflective life. And I think what is exciting about the work is the energy that you receive in the give and take of interaction with others, in testing ideas. It's enlivening. And for me, I don't even know that it's a word, but aliveness is a good measure of whether you're in the right space. And so far, I feel alive when I do the work.
I would say for me, very much like Pastor Ron, I'm an introvert. And so the one-to-one either gives you energy or it drains you. And so the possibility of gaining momentum through getting to know someone else and connecting is really powerful.
Yes, it is.
And I would say, if I could share an organizing moment, recently one of our best organizers, we were at an immigration action at ICE Detention Center. And this organizer had prepped the wife of a detainee, and we were prepared, she was prepared to go inside and deliver, a letter, deliver a letter. And at the end of the action, after the rally and the speeches and the call to action, they were going to go in, but they weren't, but the wife was afraid to go in alone. But this organizer had not shared with the leader that she was also undocumented. And so the organizer turned to me and said, would you go in with her and deliver the letter? And I said, yes, I'll go in. In a split second, she turned around, she walked right in. She gave up her coat and everything and walked right in. And I could just feel myself, I was crying, because in that moment, she was giving her life. She was sacrificing her life in order to model something for this leader, without sharing that she was also in a similar predicament, that going in was a risk for her. And I think it was in that moment that I really understood the power of teaching, and every moment being a teachable moment and a learning moment. And that is what energizes me to continue, because in those one-to-ones, you're learning and you're also teaching. Each other at the same time. And so it's a powerful, can be a powerful moment.
Well, in closing, just before I turn it back to Rachel, you've all made me think about and that question, a concept that, again, back to the spiritual traditions that you've all talked about really eloquently. I know I've spent a lot of time thinking about the one-to-ones, trying to get and wrestling with some of the same anxieties, quite frankly, that you've all articulated. But this idea, and that was a real powerful illustration of it, Shoshanah. I think we, in organizing in our training, in an attempt, again, particularly with the Muslim community and the Muslim tradition, there's a verse that's often repeated, particularly in interfaith settings and others, about God created us into nations and tribes. And then the next thing is لِتَعَارَفُوا, right? إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. God has created you into nations and tribes so that you may get to know one another. And لِتَعَارَفُوا, we use that idea that knowing is a deep knowing. It is an understanding, right? It is to understand one another. And so there's a sacredness to the idea of understanding one another and understanding the stories. And there's many prophetic moments in which, for instance, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually chastised people who tried to interface with someone and said, you don't know that person. One of the most famous stories is when a Bedouin comes in the midst of this very sacred setting, and he's with these companions and the Bedouin comes in and urinates in the corner of the masjid, right, the mosque, prophet's mosque, in the presence of the prophet, right, with these, and they immediately run to try to assault him, these guys and his companions, in what they think is to protect his honor. How dare you do that? And he, pulls them off and says, like, he comes from, first of all, he chastised them. Before he chastised them, he tells the same kind of Muslim men who are about to who we think about as righteous companions, certainly, but he gives them a lesson in humility. He says, instead of, going to assault them, go get a bucket of water and actually clean up the urine. So that was their first assignment, right? Was actually go clean up this man's urine. Then, secondly, there was this conversation about, you don't know where he comes from. You don't know anything about him. You don't know the background. You don't know, what it is to live in a desert. You don't know his context, right? So there is this idea about one-to-ones and getting to know one another's stories and getting to deeply understand someone is about what moves them, what is their self-interest, what does make them angry, what does make them passionate, right? And the other reason I think that drives me to that work is, I think a central issue that I think about the relevance of organizing and faith communities now. I know certainly in the Muslim community in America, and I would venture to say in other faith congregations and institutions, I may be a little presumptuous to say this, but we're all in trouble a little bit, right? We're all in some cases on the ropes. We're dealing with questions about relevance, questions about continuity, questions about, ability, sustainability, intergenerational dynamics. And I genuinely feel that it is in the self-interest of our community, right? And now I say as a Muslim, they have to get organized. They have to get engaged. They have to become part. Our stories need to be meaningful, because the other thing about organizing is realizing this is never enough. It's great that a Pastor Ron and a Jeff and traditional leaders of various institutions can sit down but if bases can't really get mobilized, if we can't model and it goes deeper, then we're in trouble. We're in trouble. And as our communities, and as evidenced by the moment that we're in now, in so many cases, the conversations of Ferguson get separated from the conversation that the president's having tonight about immigration. That gets separated from the conversations that are happening when anti-Sharia legislations are proliferating across the country in the same state legislatures that are introducing some of the most draconian, anti-immigration bills. And it's our communities have not only been incapable of organizing internally, but have not been able to see the ability and the power of what comes when we can connect our narratives together. And I genuinely believe that those things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they're mutually affirming. And this goes back to the idea of distinction and difference. I genuinely believe that when the Jewish community and the congregations that we're working with are engaged outside of the Jewish community, that the vibrance of that Jewish community becomes that much stronger. I've seen it, right? I've seen what happens when Muslim communities are engaged with one another. Their communities become more relevant, right? They deal with some of the very internal issues. And that used to be our fundamental premise, that to fight back against that idea, work with the Jewish community, work with the Black community, work with Latino, work with folks in Little Village. We're struggling here, right? But the response to that is, in fact, by agitating this idea of movement to get beyond that in fact it is in your self-interest. You will begin to realize that the struggles that you think you are dealing with here, your ability to actually speak to those struggles become much more strengthened when you have the opportunity to be in relationship, meaningful relationship. And that drives me to do what is sometimes very difficult, draining, exhausting, debilitating. What other things can I say? Work, but ultimately life-affirming work. So,
if I could really add real quick.
Yeah.
You talked about one of your proudest moments. One of my proudest moments came recently. And it actually wasn't on an issue that was actually being led by United Congress. It was the driver's license issue. And, but you say, why was it one of my proudest moments? Because Rami talked a whole lot about really aligning your public and private persona, right? Because if I'm really going to be in solidarity with Muslims, in solidarity with immigrants, then that means that my personal thoughts about them have to be of such that when I'm confronted publicly, I'm ready to defend, right? And so that's kind of where that issue with the driver's license kind of fell, because when I would go to Springfield and I'm talking to the Black Caucus, the Black Caucus is like, why are you working on this issue? And it's at that point where you really, now you in the room and then there's no immigrant there, there's just you and the Black Caucus, right? And he feels comfortable saying that to you, and now you've got to say what it is that you really believe. And we had some real teachable moments down in Springfield where we was able to talk to the Black Caucus and was able to move the Black Caucus on an issue that, as a bloc, they was ready to vote against the driver's license issue. And while that's not something that's talked about a lot, I feel personally proud that I had a moment in Springfield where I was able to have influence on something that wasn't particularly a United Congress-led issue.
Well,
And
it was
it
crucial
passed.
to the passage of the bill.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I'm going to let Rachel wrap us up for the evening. And
I'm not going to try to tie it all together. What I'd like to do instead is to thank you for sharing your stories, the ones that inspire you and the ones that agitate you, and for modeling for all of us the deep relationship and trust that makes this work possible. Maybe I will end by sharing a story. It's a story that a Hasidic Rebbe from Poland, Rabbi Chaim Halberstam of Sanz, used to tell. He said the man was walking through the woods and he got lost. He couldn't find his way. He kept trying to find his way back out to the edge, to a road, to anything that he recognized. But he just found himself getting deeper and deeper into the forest and more disoriented. And after being in this forest, what seemed like forever, he actually saw another person, a woman, and he walked up to her and he said, "Do you know where you are?" She said, "Yes, I'm in the woods." "Do you know how to get out?" "No, I'm lost. I've been lost in the woods forever. I keep trying to get out, to find a road, to find anything similar and anything familiar, and I can't. I feel like I'm getting deeper and deeper in the woods." And he said, "Well, you know where you've been that hasn't worked, and I know where I've been that hasn't worked, so let's walk together and we'll find our way." So thank you very much for modeling both of what worked and for struggling with what hasn't worked yet as we work together to find our way. And thank you all for coming.
Okay, yeah, we should have one.